What if your entire life was a battle for survival? What if every single pregnancy was a gamble with your very life? What if the future for your children was simply more of the same brutal struggle? Step back in time to the year 1285. Number 11, the perilous journey of childbirth itself. Imagine the absolute terror, the raw, primal fear that gripped a woman living in 1285 as the first pangs of labor began. For a peasant woman, childbirth was not merely an inconvenience, a brief period of discomfort before a bundle of joy arrived. It was a journey into the unknown, a passage across a threshold where life and death danced a perilous tango. There were no hospitals, no doctors with sterile instruments, no pain relief beyond what the body could naturally muster, or what a few herbal concoctions might vaguely offer. Birthing chamber was often the same smoky, cramped dwelling where the family ate, slept, and lived their entire lives, a place shared with animals during the colder months, certainly not a sanctuary of hygiene. The midwife, if one was even available, was likely an older woman from the village, her knowledge passed down through generations, a mixture of practical experience, superstition, and traditional remedies. She would have seen countless births and witnessed just as many tragic ends. Her hands, though perhaps calloused from a lifetime of hard work, were the only tools available. There were no antiseptic washes, no understanding of germ theory. The very act of examination could introduce deadly infection. Puerperal fever, a silent killer, was a common specter, stealing mothers away within days or weeks of what should have been a joyous event. It was a fever that would rack the body, send chills through the bones, and slowly, inevitably, lead to a devastating end, leaving behind a new infant with no mother to nourish it. Think about the sheer physical endurance required. Labor could last for days, a relentless ordeal of contractions, exhaustion, and agony. The peasant woman's body was already worn from a lifetime of hard labor, from hauling water, tending crops, grinding grain, and endless chores. Her diet was likely meager, often lacking in essential nutrients, leaving her physically depleted even before the monumental task of bringing a new life into the world. Her bones might ache, her muscles might be weak, and yet her body was expected to perform this extraordinary feat without falter. There was no resting before birth, no period of recuperation after. Life simply continued, demanding, unrelenting. The baby presented in a difficult position. If the labor stalled, if there was excessive bleeding, there was precious little that could be done. There were no forceps, no C-sections, no understanding of internal complications. A prolonged labor often meant death for both mother and child. The wails of a woman in labor might be heard across the small hamlet, a grim reminder to every other woman of the fate that awaited them. It was a sound that carried a heavy weight, a mixture of empathy and unspoken dread. Every successful birth was a miracle, a testament to sheer human resilience against overwhelming odds. Failures, the stillborn children, the mothers lost to hemorrhage, those were common, heartbreaking realities etched into the collective memory of the village. The emotional toll was immense. How could a woman not approach each new pregnancy with a profound sense of anxiety? The anticipation of a new life was inextricably linked with the fear of her own demise, or the death of her unborn child. She might have made arrangements for her older children, knowing that any day could be her last. Her neighbors might have gathered, not just to offer support, but to be ready to perform the last rites, to say the prayers for the dying, to comfort the bereaved family. Air in the small dwelling during a difficult birth would have been thick with unspoken prayers, with desperate hopes, and with the chilling awareness of what might be. Even after a successful birth, the danger did not vanish. The new mother was vulnerable. Infections could still set in, and the exhaustion could linger for weeks. Yet within days, sometimes hours, she would be expected to rise and resume her duties. The field still needed tending, the animals still needed care, the fire still needed stoking, and the other children still needed feeding. There was no maternity leave, no period of rest. The cycle of labor, both in the physical sense of childbirth and in the daily toil of survival, was relentless, an unbroken chain of demanding tasks that defined the very existence of a peasant woman in 1285. The very act of bringing life into the world was, for her, a life-threatening event, an ultimate sacrifice that she was expected to endure again and again, with little more than courage and the hope of survival. Number 10, the silent scythe of infant mortality. Imagine holding your newborn child, tiny and perfect, in your arms, only to know, deep in your heart, that the odds of them reaching their 5th birthday were brutally slim. For a peasant woman in 1285, the joy of a new birth was perpetually shadowed by the overwhelming reality of infant and child mortality. This was not an occasional tragedy. It was a constant, heartbreaking presence in their lives, a silent scythe that swept through every family, claiming the innocent and leaving behind a trail of grief. How many tiny coffins were made, perhaps little more than wooden boxes, to bury the hopes and dreams that had just begun to blossom? The sheer numbers are staggering to consider from our modern perspective. Historians estimate that perhaps 1 in 3 children, or even 1 in 2 in some regions, would not survive their first year of life. And of those who made it past infancy, many more would succumb before reaching adolescence. This meant that a woman who bore 8 or 10 children might be fortunate to see only 2 or 3 reach adulthood. Pregnancy, each birth, was an investment of profound emotional labor, a pouring out of hope and love, knowing that it could all be snatched away at any moment. What were the unseen enemies that claimed these precious lives? Disease was rampant and utterly ruthless. Without any understanding of germs or hygiene, simple infections could become deadly. Diarrhea, often caused by contaminated water or food, was a swift killer, dehydrating tiny bodies beyond recovery. Respiratory infections, like pneumonia or bronchitis, would sweep through cramped, smoky homes, their tiny lungs unable to cope. Measles, smallpox, diphtheria, these were not just childhood illnesses, they were often death sentences, leaving entire families devastated. The weakened immune systems of children, often malnourished themselves, offered little defense against these relentless onslaughts. Beyond disease, there were accidents. A toddler wandering too close to the open hearth, a child falling into a well, a swift kick from an animal in the communal barn. The world of a peasant child was full of unseen dangers, and constant supervision was a luxury few mothers could afford. They were often working in the fields or tending to other chores, leaving older siblings or neighbors to watch the younger ones, sometimes inadequately. The vigilance required was immense, and yet, no matter how careful, tragedy could strike in an instant. Malnutrition also played a huge role. While mothers breastfed, sometimes for years, their own diets were often insufficient. This meant their milk, while life-sustaining, might lack the full spectrum of nutrients needed for optimal development. Once weaning began, children were introduced to the same course, limited diet as their parents, mostly grains, some vegetables, perhaps a little cheese or milk if the family owned animals. Protein was scarce, vitamins even more so. A child constantly hungry, whose body was struggling to grow, was far more susceptible to illness and less likely to recover. The cycle was vicious. Poverty led to poor nutrition, which led to weakened health, which led to death. The emotional impact on these mothers cannot be overstated. Imagine the profound grief, not just once but multiple times. Each tiny life lost chipped away at her spirit, leaving an indelible mark. How did she cope with such overwhelming sorrow, especially when there was no time for prolonged mourning? The demands of survival meant she had to push through her grief, pick herself up, and continue with the relentless work of feeding and caring for the living. There were no therapists, no support groups. Grief was a private, heavy burden, often shared only in quiet moments with a sympathetic neighbor or whispered prayers. Yet, amidst this sorrow, there was also a desperate need for hope. Each new pregnancy was a renewed gamble, a fresh chance for a child to survive. Mothers would cling to superstitions, offering prayers to saints, tying charms to their children's cradles, seeking out wise women for protective amulets. These were not just acts of faith, they were desperate attempts to gain some semblance of control in a world where so much was beyond their power. Fear of loss was a constant companion, an invisible weight on their shoulders, shaping every interaction, every lullaby, every quiet moment with their fragile, precious children. The silent scythe of infant mortality was a stark reminder of the brutality of life for peasant women in 1285, a burden of heartbreak that few modern mothers could ever truly comprehend. Number 9, the unceasing rhythm of pregnancy. Consider a life where your body was almost constantly engaged in the profound, exhausting labor of pregnancy or the demanding act of breastfeeding. For a peasant woman in 1285, the rhythm of her life was intrinsically linked to her fertility, a relentless cycle of conception, gestation, and nursing, often with barely a break in between. There was no reliable birth control, no family planning beyond perhaps prolonged breastfeeding, which might delay but rarely prevent the next pregnancy. Her body was a vessel, constantly creating new life, even as it was worn down by the daily demands of survival. From the moment a young woman married, usually in her late teens or early 20s, the expectation was clear: she would bear children, and many of them. The survival of the family, the continuation of the lineage, and the provision of future labor for the farm all depended on her fertility. Within months of marriage, a peasant woman would likely find herself pregnant, and once that child was born, she might become pregnant again within a year or two. This meant that over her reproductive lifespan, from her late teens to her early 40s, she could easily endure 10, 12, or even more pregnancies. Imagine the physical toll this took. Pregnancy was a profound drain on her already limited nutritional resources. Her body, often already struggling with a meager diet of grains and vegetables, had to divert vital nutrients to grow a new human being. Symptoms that modern women might experience as mild annoyances, morning sickness, fatigue, backaches, swelling, would have been amplified for a woman who was simultaneously engaged in back-breaking manual labor. There was no resting when pregnant, no special treatment, no time off from her duties. She continued to work in the fields, to haul water, to tend the hearth, to care for her other children, all while her body was undergoing immense physiological changes. The act of breastfeeding, often extended for 2 or even 3 years, further contributed to this unceasing rhythm. While it was crucial for the infant's survival, it also suppressed ovulation for a time, acting as a natural, albeit unreliable, form of spacing. But once menstruation returned, the cycle began anew. A woman might be simultaneously nursing a toddler, carrying a new baby in her womb, and caring for several other young children. Her body was a perpetual engine of creation and nourishment, leaving little left for her own recuperation. The lack of control over her own body was another silent burden. Fertility was not her own to command. It was dictated by biology, by the needs of her family, and by societal expectation. Every symptom of pregnancy, every skipped menstruation, would have been met with a mix of resignation and weary anticipation. There was no choice in the matter, only the acceptance of the next pregnancy, the next physical challenge, the next gamble with her own life. How could a woman feel truly autonomous when her physical being was so entirely bound to this relentless cycle? The cumulative effect of so many pregnancies, often one after another, would have aged her prematurely. Her teeth might suffer, her bones might weaken, her body might sag and ache. She would carry the visible signs of her prolific motherhood, not just in her children, but in the toll taken on her physical form. Her life was a testament to endurance, a continuous outpouring of vital energy dedicated to the propagation of her family. This unceasing rhythm of pregnancy shaped every aspect of her existence. It dictated her physical capabilities, her emotional state, and her daily routines. It was a constant reminder of her primary role, her essential contribution to her family's survival. And while the birth of each new child brought a flicker of hope and perhaps a moment of joy, it was also a grim affirmation of the next physical ordeal to come, the next journey into the unknown, all part of the relentless, demanding, and utterly unavoidable rhythm of a peasant woman's life in 1285. Her body was never truly her own, always in service to the next generation, a never-ending testament to life's most fundamental and most burdensome demand. Number 8, the back-breaking labor of the fields and home. Imagine a life where your day began before dawn and ended long after dusk, a relentless cycle of physical exertion that knew no seasons, no respite, and certainly no sick days. For a peasant woman in 1285, motherhood was not a separate sphere of life. It was interwoven with a demanding regimen of back-breaking labor, both in the communal fields and within her own cramped, smoky home. Her hands were rarely idle, her body constantly in motion, whether she was pregnant, nursing, or simply trying to survive the day. Outside the humble dwelling the fields called. Peasant women were not merely domestic figures, they were indispensable agricultural workers. They participated in every stage of the farming year. During planting season, they would walk behind the crude wooden plow, scattering seeds by hand, their backs bent, their muscles straining. They would weed the growing crops under the hot summer sun, their hands digging into the earth, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. Harvest time was perhaps the most intense period, a frantic race against the elements. Women would bend for hours, cutting grain with sickles, gathering bundles of wheat or barley, their fingers raw, their bodies aching from the repetitive motion. They would then carry these heavy loads, often on their backs or heads, from the fields to the village, a feat of strength that defies modern imagination. Beyond the major crops, there were the kitchen gardens, tended with meticulous care, providing essential vegetables and herbs that supplemented the meager family diet. They would dig, plant, water, and harvest these patches of land, often while balancing a young child on their hip or supervising older children engaged in similar tasks. They gathered firewood from the forests, a never-ending chore that required long treks and the strength to haul heavy bundles back to the hearth. They foraged for wild berries, nuts, and edible plants, adding crucial nutrients to their meals, a dangerous task that could expose them to wild animals or harsh weather. Inside the home, the labor continued relentlessly. There was no running water. Every drop for cooking, cleaning, and drinking had to be fetched from a communal well or stream, often a considerable distance away. This meant multiple trips throughout the day, carrying heavy wooden buckets, a task that became even more arduous when pregnant or with a small child in tow. Preparation of food was an immensely time-consuming and physical process. Grain had to be ground, often by hand with quern stones, a laborious task that could take hours to produce enough flour for the family's bread. Meat, if available, had to be butchered and prepared, vegetables cleaned and chopped. All cooking was done over an open fire, requiring constant attention, monitoring, and the bending and lifting of heavy pots. Cleaning was a perpetual battle against dirt, soot, and pests in a dwelling shared with animals and lacking proper sanitation. Clothes made of coarse wool or linen had to be washed by hand in cold water, often pounded against stones, a chore that left hands chapped and raw and muscles screaming. Repairs to garments were constant, involving intricate needlework in dim light, a skill passed down from mother to daughter. There was also the care of livestock, chickens, pigs, perhaps a cow, that often shared the family dwelling, requiring feeding, cleaning, and milking. Constant presence of animals, while providing warmth and sustenance, also added to the burden of dirt and potential disease. And all of this physical labor was performed not in isolated shifts, but simultaneously with the constant demands of motherhood. A woman might be breastfeeding while kneading dough, or watching a child while weeding the fields. The physical toll of pregnancy and childbirth did not excuse her from these duties. She would often return to work within days, sometimes even hours of giving birth, her body still weak and recovering because the family's survival depended on it. There was no one else to do the work. Children from a very young age would be brought into the labor pool, learning these skills by observing and participating, perpetuating the cycle. This brutal, unceasing physical exertion was not just a part of her life. It was her life, a heavy, unyielding burden that shaped her body, her spirit, and her very existence as a peasant mother in 1285. Number 7, the gnawing hunger, malnutrition and its legacy. Imagine living with a constant, low-grade hunger, a gnawing emptiness in your stomach that never truly goes away. For a peasant woman in 1285, malnutrition was not an abstract concept. It was a daily reality, a silent, pervasive enemy that weakened her body, dulled her mind, and cast a long shadow over her ability to nurture her children and sustain her family. Their diet was profoundly monotonous and often insufficient, a relentless testament to the struggle for basic sustenance. What did they eat? The staple was grain, usually rye or barley, baked into coarse bread or made into a thick porridge. This provided calories but little else. Vegetables came from their small garden plots, cabbages, onions, perhaps some beans or root crops, but these were seasonal and limited. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps a bit of pork after an autumn slaughter, or some wild game if the men were lucky hunters and brave enough to poach on the Lord's land. Fish might be available if they lived near a river or coast, but often it was dried or salted, adding little fresh sustenance. Dairy products like cheese or curds might be produced if they owned a cow or a few goats, but milk itself was often reserved for the very young or sick. This meager diet had profound consequences, especially for women of childbearing age. Constant pregnancy and breastfeeding placed enormous demands on a woman's body, requiring extra calories, protein, and vital micronutrients. Yet these were precisely the things most lacking in their daily fare. Imagine the impact of iron deficiency, leading to chronic fatigue, weakness, and an increased risk of hemorrhage during childbirth. Consider the effects of vitamin deficiencies, leading to poor vision, brittle bones, and weakened immune systems, making them more susceptible to every passing illness. A woman constantly depleted was less able to fight off infection, less able to recover from the physical trauma of childbirth, and less able to provide adequate nourishment for her growing children. Impact of malnutrition extended to her children even before they were born. A poorly nourished mother was more likely to give birth to a low-weight infant, a child already starting life at a disadvantage, more vulnerable to disease and less likely to survive. And once born, the children were dependent on their mother's milk, which, while miraculous, could only be as nourishing as the mother's own diet allowed. As children transitioned to solid foods, they too faced the same limited diet, often suffering from conditions like rickets due to vitamin D deficiency or stunted growth from protein and calorie shortages. The legacy of malnutrition was clearly visible in the physical development of the entire peasant population: shorter stature, weaker bones, and a general frailty compared to the wealthier classes. Famines were a recurring horror, an ever-present threat that turned chronic hunger into acute starvation. Bad harvest due to too much rain, too little rain, or pest infestations could mean that families would simply not have enough to eat to survive the winter. Grain prices would skyrocket, leaving the poorest with nothing. During these times, people would resort to eating whatever they could find: roots, bark, even dirt, anything to quell the desperate pangs of hunger. These periods were devastating, claiming lives en masse and leaving survivors even weaker and more vulnerable. Mothers would face the unbearable choice of watching their children slowly starve, their own bodies too emaciated to produce milk, their hearts breaking with each wasted breath. This relentless struggle for food permeated every aspect of their lives. It dictated their work in the fields, their desperate foraging, their meager savings, and their constant anxiety. There was no security, no safety net. One bad season, one illness, one lost animal, and the delicate balance between subsistence and starvation could tip precariously. The gnawing hunger was not just a physical sensation. It was a deeply embedded burden, shaping their bodies, limiting their futures, and defining the very essence of their struggle as peasant mothers in 1285, leaving a legacy of perpetual insufficiency and vulnerability. Number 6, a home against the elements, harsh living conditions. Imagine a dwelling that offered little true respite from the biting cold of winter, the oppressive heat of summer, or the ever-present dampness that seeped into your bones. For a peasant woman in 1285, her home was not a sanctuary of comfort and safety. It was a fragile shelter, often shared with animals, constantly battling against the elements and harboring unseen threats. These harsh living conditions placed immense burdens on mothers, directly impacting their own health and the survival of their children. Most peasant homes were small, single-room structures, typically built from rough-hewn timber, wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and dung or stone, depending on local resources. The floors were usually packed earth, perpetually damp and difficult to keep clean. Windows, if they existed at all, were small, unglazed openings, covered with wooden shutters or perhaps a piece of oiled animal skin, offering little light and even less insulation. The roof, often thatched with straw, provided some protection from rain, but could leak and was a constant fire hazard. The central feature of the home was the open hearth, a crude fireplace without a chimney in many cases. The smoke from the cooking fire filled the room, eventually finding its way out through the door or roof. While it offered some warmth in winter and helped preserve meat, this constant exposure to smoke had dire consequences for respiratory health, especially for women and children who spent most of their time indoors. Imagine the burning eyes, the coughing, the chronic lung ailments that would plague them from a young age, weakening their bodies and making them more susceptible to fatal infections. Crowding was another inescapable reality. The entire family, often including multiple generations, would live, eat, and sleep in this single room. During colder months, livestock, chickens, pigs, sometimes even a cow, might be brought inside for warmth and protection, adding to the cramped conditions, the smells, and the accumulation of waste. While the animals provided a degree of warmth, they also brought parasites, fleas, and disease vectors directly into the living space, contributing to an environment ripe for the spread of illness. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. There were no latrines within the house. Human and animal waste would be deposited in pits outside or simply allowed to accumulate nearby. Water, as discussed, had to be fetched from an external source, often shared and easily contaminated. The lack of clean water for drinking, cooking, and personal hygiene was a constant vector for diseases like dysentery and cholera, which could devastate a family, especially young children. Imagine trying to keep a baby clean or preparing food safely in an environment where clean water was precious and basic hygiene was an unknown concept. Pervasive damp and cold, particularly in winter, was another major threat. Poor insulation and open doors, homes were drafty and difficult to heat effectively. This led to chronic chills, coughs, and made common colds escalate into life-threatening pneumonia. Damp earth floor promoted rheumatism and other joint ailments, adding to the aches and pains of daily life. For a new mother or a fragile infant, the cold was a direct threat to survival, leading to hypothermia or exacerbating existing illnesses. These harsh living conditions fostered a constant battle against disease and discomfort. A mother's daily struggle involved trying to keep her children warm, fed, and healthy in an environment that seemed designed to make them sick. Constant cleaning, the battle against pests, the never-ending effort to keep the fire going, all of these chores were made more difficult by the primitive nature of their homes. Her home was a place of endless work and limited comfort, a relentless reminder of the precariousness of their existence, a fundamental burden that shaped the health and well-being of every peasant woman and her children in 1285. Number 5. The invisible illness, lack of medical understanding and care. Imagine a world where illness struck without warning, without clear cause, and often without any hope of effective treatment. For a peasant woman in 1285, the invisible illness, the silent onset of disease, was a terrifying and frequent companion, a burden magnified by a profound lack of medical understanding and care. When sickness gripped a child or herself, there were no doctors to call, no hospitals to rush to, only desperation, folk remedies, and prayer. Prevailing understanding of health and disease was a complex mixture of ancient Greek humoral theory, religious belief, and superstition. Illness was often attributed to an imbalance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or to divine punishment, the work of evil spirits, or even the malevolent gaze of a witch. This meant that treatments were often ineffective or worse, harmful. Bleeding, purging, and the application of leeches were common practices, intended to rebalance the humors, but often further weakened an already sick individual. Formal medical practitioners, such as they were scarce and largely inaccessible to the peasantry. Highly educated physicians were few, confined to urban centers, and served only the wealthy elite. For the vast majority, their only recourse was the local wise woman, the village elder, or perhaps a traveling peddler with a bag of mysterious potions. These individuals possessed a practical knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, passed down through generations. Certain plants might indeed have had medicinal properties, willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleep, but their application was often hit or miss, dosages were unknown, and efficacy was limited, especially against serious infections. Hygiene, as we understand it, was non-existent. The concept of microscopic germs causing disease was centuries away from being discovered. Contaminated water sources, communal living spaces shared with animals, and the lack of proper waste disposal created fertile ground for the rapid spread of epidemics. Diseases like the plague, dysentery, smallpox, measles, and influenza could sweep through a village, claiming entire families in a matter of weeks, leaving behind widespread devastation and a profound sense of helplessness. A mother would watch her children sicken, one after another, their bodies racked with fever, their breathing labored, and she would be utterly powerless to stop the inevitable march of death. Childbirth itself was an arena of immense medical ignorance. As explored earlier, infections were rampant, and there was no understanding of antisepsis. Puerperal fever caused by bacterial infection often claimed new mothers within days of birth, leaving behind a motherless infant. When a child was born with a deformity or a severe illness, it was often seen as a curse or an ill omen, leading to fear and sometimes even neglect, rather than a compassionate understanding of their condition. The sheer desperation for relief would drive people to extreme measure. Charms, amulets, pilgrimages to sacred shrines, and fervent prayers to saints were common. These were not just expressions of faith, they were desperate attempts to gain some semblance of control over the terrifying and unpredictable nature of illness. A mother might spend her meager savings on a relic, or embark on a long, arduous journey to a holy site, clutching at any straw of hope that might save her dying child. the emotional toll of this medical ignorance was immense. Imagine the frustration, the fear, the agonizing helplessness of watching a loved one suffer, knowing there was nothing truly effective you could do. Constant threat of illness hung over every peasant household, a silent predator always lurking. It meant that a simple cut could become a fatal infection, a common cold could escalate into deadly pneumonia, and an epidemic could decimate a family in days. This profound lack of medical understanding and accessible care was a heavy, constant burden, a terrifying lottery that every peasant mother and her children were forced to play in 1285, with life and death as the ultimate stakes. Number 4, the relentless cycle of poverty and debt. Imagine being born into a world where your future was largely predetermined, where the vast majority of your life would be spent toiling simply to survive, with little hope of escape or improvement. For a peasant woman in 1285, the relentless cycle of poverty and debt was not just a hardship. It was an inescapable cage, a system that bound her and her family to the land and to the whims of their feudal lord. This economic reality permeated every aspect of her existence, adding layers of stress and vulnerability to her already demanding life as a mother. Peasants were, by and large, serfs or villeins, tied to the land they worked. They did not own it, they merely held it in tenancy from a lord, for whom they owed a complex web of obligations. This included not just a portion of their harvest, but also labor service on the lord's domain, his personal lands, for a set number of days each week or year. Imagine working your own meager plot to feed your family, only to then spend valuable time and energy cultivating someone else's land, knowing that the fruits of that labor would never be yours. This forced labor, often during peak seasons when their own crops needed the most attention, directly impacted their family's food security. Beyond labor, there were numerous taxes, fines, and fees. They might pay a rent in kind, perhaps a certain measure of grain, chickens, or eggs. There were fees for using the lord's mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, or his wine press. A peasant wished to marry someone from another manor, or if a daughter needed to leave the village, a special fee was often levied by the lord. Even inheritance could be taxed, known as a heriot, where the lord would claim the best animal or piece of equipment upon a peasant's death, further impoverishing the family. This constant drain on their limited resources meant that peasant families lived on the very edge of subsistence. There was little to no surplus, and therefore no opportunity to save or build wealth. One bad harvest, one illness that incapacitated a family member, one unexpected tax, could plunge them into immediate debt. They might borrow from a wealthier neighbor, or from a moneylender, often at exorbitant rates, creating a spiral of debt that was incredibly difficult to escape. Debts could accumulate, sometimes across generations, trapping families in a perpetual state of financial obligation. For a mother, this economic insecurity translated into constant anxiety. How would she feed her children through the long winter? What if the meager harvest failed? What if one of her children fell ill and needed remedies she couldn't afford? Every decision was weighed against the harsh reality of their limited means. Buying a new tool, replacing a worn-out garment, or even affording a small comfort was often out of the question. Their lives were a tightrope walk between producing just enough and succumbing to starvation or destitution. The lack of social mobility was another crushing aspect of this poverty. A peasant child was born into a peasant family and almost certainly would live and die as a peasant. There were virtually no avenues for education or advancement. Sons would follow their fathers into the fields, daughters their mothers into the arduous dual roles of farm and home. This meant that a mother, despite her hopes, knew that her children were destined for the same life of unremitting toil and economic struggle that she herself endured. This lack of future prospects, this knowledge that the cycle would simply repeat itself, must have been a profound emotional burden. This relentless cycle of poverty and debt defined the parameters of their lives. It dictated their diet, their housing, their clothing, and their daily labor. It stripped them of autonomy and left them vulnerable to every caprice of nature and man. For a peasant woman in 1285, managing her household and raising her children meant navigating a treacherous economic landscape where survival was a daily gamble, and the shadow of destitution was never far away, a fundamental and deeply ingrained burden on her every waking moment. Number 3, the emotional landscape of loss and resilience. Imagine living in a world where profound grief was a familiar visitor, almost an expected part of life, yet one for which there was little time or space for sustained mourning. For a peasant woman in 1285, the emotional landscape of her motherhood was deeply scarred by constant loss: the loss of children, the loss of health, the loss of basic security, yet it was also paradoxically shaped by an extraordinary capacity for resilience. This duality of profound sorrow and unwavering endurance formed a unique emotional burden. As we have seen, the brutal realities of infant and child mortality meant that a mother would likely experience the death of multiple children. Imagine giving birth to a child, nurturing them through infancy, watching them take their first steps, only to have them snatched away by a fever, a cough, or an accident. And then, a few years later, to experience that same gut-wrenching heartbreak again, and perhaps again. How does a heart mend when it is repeatedly shattered? The emotional toll of such repeated loss is almost unimaginable, a constant, pervasive sorrow that must have etched itself deep into her soul. There was no formal bereavement counseling, no time off to grieve. The demands of daily survival were relentless. The other living children still needed food, the animals still needed tending, the fields still needed working. A mother might spend a day or two in quiet sorrow, perhaps supported by immediate family or close neighbors, but the world would not stop for her grief. She had to pick herself up, often with a raw, aching heart, and continue her duties. This forced suppression of grief, the inability to fully process such profound losses, must have weighed heavily on her spirit, a silent burden carried throughout her life. Beyond the loss of children, there was the loss of health and vitality, both her own and her husband's. Constant labor, poor nutrition, and repeated pregnancies took a heavy toll on her body, aging her prematurely. She might suffer from chronic pain, exhaustion, or various ailments that she had to endure without relief. If her husband fell ill or died, the burden on her shoulders became even heavier, as she had to manage the farm and family largely alone, often with fewer resources and more vulnerable to the Lord's demands. The loss of a partner not only meant emotional devastation, but also a profound economic threat, placing her and her children in an even more precarious position. Life was also filled with the loss of potential, the crushing awareness that her children were destined for the same grueling existence, with little hope of a better future. There was no escaping the cycle of poverty and hardship. This understanding, this quiet resignation to the limits of their world, must have been a form of emotional burden in itself, a constant battle against the desire for more, for something different. Yet amidst this landscape of pervasive loss, peasant women also exhibited incredible resilience. They found ways to cope, to endure, to continue. Their faith, however simple, often provided a source of comfort and hope. Community bonds, however tenuous, offered practical support in times of crisis. The small joys of life, a good harvest, a healthy new baby, a successful marriage, a brief festival, would have been cherished deeply, providing moments of respite from the hardship. They drew strength from their children, from the simple act of nurturing life, from the quiet dignity of their labor. This resilience was not an absence of grief, but rather an ability to carry it, to move forward despite it. It was a profound internal strength, born out of necessity, a quiet determination to survive and to ensure the survival of her family. The emotional landscape of a peasant mother in 1285 was a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure unimaginable sorrow, while continuing to find meaning and purpose in the most challenging of circumstances. This continuous navigation between heartbreak and stubborn hope was a unique and heavy burden, often unseen but profoundly felt, shaping the core of her motherhood. Number 2, the burden of preparation, teaching survival to the next generation. Imagine the weight of knowing that your primary role as a mother was not just to nurture and love your children, but to equip them, from their earliest years, with the exact same arduous skills that defined your own struggling existence. For a peasant woman in 1285, the burden of preparation was immense. She had to meticulously train her children for a life of relentless manual labor, preparing them to enter a world that offered little comfort or opportunity beyond the fields and the hearth. This was a form of education unlike any modern schooling, a practical, unforgiving apprenticeship in survival. There were no books, no formal classrooms, no curriculum of abstract knowledge. Learning for a peasant child was entirely experiential and imitative. From the moment they could toddle, children were integrated into the adult world of work. A mother's primary responsibility was to transform her offspring from vulnerable infants into capable, hardworking members of the family unit, ready to contribute to its survival. This meant starting very young, with simple tasks, gradually increasing the complexity and demand as the child grew. A young girl from the age of perhaps 3 or 4 would begin to observe her mother. She would watch as her mother kneaded dough, recognizing the rhythm and effort involved. She would see her mother fetching water, grinding grain, tending the fire, mending clothes. First tasks might be to gather sticks for the fire, to carry small amounts of water, or to watch a younger sibling. These were not games. These were essential contributions to the household economy. Her mother would patiently, or perhaps sometimes impatiently, demonstrate, guide, and correct. The skills of housekeeping, food preparation, and rudimentary clothing care were not just chores. They were life skills, absolutely critical for her future role as a wife and mother herself. In the fields, both boys and girls would be put to work as soon as their small bodies could manage. They might scare away birds from the crops, gather stones from the soil, or help weed. As they grew older, they would participate in planting and harvesting, learning the precise movements of the sickle, the proper way to tie a sheaf of grain, the rhythm of communal labor. A mother would teach her daughters how to forage for wild edibles, how to identify medicinal herbs, how to care for small animals. She would instruct them in the laborious process of preparing food, from the initial cleaning of raw ingredients to the precise cooking over an open flame, ensuring nothing was wasted. This training was not merely about physical tasks. It was also about instilling a profound understanding of the natural world and its cycles, the rhythms of the seasons, the behavior of animals, and the delicate balance between effort and reward. It was about teaching resilience, patience, and the ability to endure hardship. A mother would teach her children to be frugal, to mend rather than replace, to value every scrap, because waste could mean starvation. She would impart the knowledge of which plants were safe to eat, which mushrooms were poisonous, where the best firewood could be found, and how to predict changes in the weather, all vital for survival. The emotional burden of this preparation lay in the knowledge that she was essentially training her children to repeat her own life of struggle. There was no aspiration for upward mobility, no hope of sending them away to a different life. Her deepest desire was for them to simply survive, to be strong enough, capable enough, and resilient enough to navigate the same brutal existence she herself endured. Quiet hope was that they would marry, establish their own households, and continue the cycle of production, ensuring the family's continuation. This burden of preparation was heavy because it was constant, demanding, and utterly essential. Every interaction, every chore, every moment spent with her children was an opportunity for instruction, a lesson in the grim realities of their world. She was not preparing them for a life of comfort or luxury, but for one of unrelenting toil, scarcity, and physical demand. This direct, hands-on, and often harsh education was a fundamental aspect of peasant motherhood in 1285, ensuring that the next generation was ready to shoulder the same crushing burdens she carried, perpetuating a cycle of survival passed down through generations. Number 1. Community, custom, and control, the social web of motherhood. Imagine navigating the immense challenges of motherhood not in isolation, but within a tightly woven, yet often restrictive, social web of community, age-old customs, and pervasive external control. For a peasant woman in 1285, her role as a mother was deeply embedded in this intricate social structure, which offered both limited support and significant limitations, forming a unique and often overlooked burden. The village was her entire world. Life was communal, centered around the rhythms of the agricultural year and the shared experiences of birth, death, marriage, and daily toil. There was a sense of collective responsibility for survival, a reliance on neighbors for assistance during planting or harvest, or in times of crisis. When a woman was in labor, female neighbors and relatives would gather, offering practical help and emotional support, sharing their wisdom and experience. When a child was born, the community would acknowledge the new life and perhaps offer small gifts or blessings. In times of illness or death, neighbors might bring food, help with chores, or offer comfort, demonstrating a practical solidarity born of shared hardship. This reciprocal support was vital, a fragile safety net in a world without formal welfare. However, this communal closeness also came with its own set of burdens. privacy was virtually non-existent. Everyone knew everyone else's business, their successes, their failures, their sorrow. Gossip, social pressure, and the weight of expectation could be immense. A woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear healthy children, to keep her household running efficiently, and to contribute effectively to the village economy. Falling short of these expectations, perhaps through repeated stillbirths or an inability to manage her household, could lead to social stigma or even ostracization. Her reputation within the community was paramount, and mothers often felt immense pressure to conform to established norms and prove their capability. Beyond the immediate community, her life was largely dictated by the powerful forces of custom and control. Customary law governed much of village life, from land tenure to marriage practices. These unwritten rules, passed down through generations, shaped expectations for women and their roles. For instance, the traditional roles of men and women in labor were deeply ingrained, with women primarily responsible for domestic work, childcare, and specific agricultural tasks, leaving little room for deviation or personal choice. These customs, while providing a framework for stability, also imposed rigid limitations on individual autonomy. Church was another pervasive influence, shaping every aspect of life from birth to death. Teachings dictated morality, family structure, and the perception of women's roles. Motherhood was glorified as a sacred duty, but within strict parameters. Religious holidays, saints' days, and regular church attendance were integral to village life, providing both spiritual solace and a powerful mechanism of social control. Church's emphasis on procreation, its stance against contraception, and its views on female purity all added layers of expectation and moral obligation to a peasant woman's experience of motherhood, reinforcing the idea that her primary purpose was to bear and raise children within the confines of a sanctioned marriage. Finally, the overarching power of the feudal lord exerted immense control over her life. As a serf, her mobility was severely restricted. She could not leave the manor without the lord's permission, which was rarely granted without a significant payment. Her marriage might require the lord's approval, and her children were born into his service. He held ultimate authority over the land she worked, the resources she could access, and the justice system she was subject to. This pervasive control meant that a peasant woman, as a mother, was not free to make many fundamental choices about her family's future. Agency was limited, her decisions often constrained by the rigid structures of feudal society. Thus, the social web of motherhood for a peasant woman in 1285 was a double-edged sword. While it offered moments of vital communal support and shared understanding, it simultaneously imposed significant burdens of expectation, scrutiny, and external control. Her life, her body, and her children were not entirely her own, but were deeply intertwined with the demands of community, the weight of custom, and the pervasive authority of the church and the Lord. This intricate social environment, while sometimes comforting, ultimately contributed to the enduring, complex, and profound burdens of motherhood for a peasant woman in the brutal reality of 1285.